Welcome to the first lecture of environmental science, and today we're going to be covering what's called environmental interrelationships, and this includes chapters 1 and 2 of all the editions of the book. And what we're going to discuss real briefly, because you do have a more detailed PowerPoint online, is a little about the nature of environmental science, because it is a discipline that involves many different other disciplines. And we're going to look at what are called some regional concerns that we have in environmental science. And then the rest of the chapter will be followed by ethical issues, because a lot of this course has to do with human decisions that we make about using an environment for resources. So to begin, this chart here basically shows all the areas that fit into what we call environmental science. And the best way to think of environmental science is think of the term science as being knowledge and not actual science in itself. Because we're going to see this whole picture of environmental science involves many things. It's very interdisciplinary. And we're going to learn that in this course as we go along. Because to be in environmental science, of course, there has to be some science. And this is going to be the whole foundation of the accuracy and the validity of our decisions. Science we're going to learn is it's very analytical. It tends to be objective if it's done correctly, and it basically deals with data and facts. We're also going to learn that it deals with the concepts of good and bad decisions, and that basically means what's good and bad as far as the benefits to humans and as the impacts on the environment, what we sometimes call our environmental footprint. So part of the science is going to involve chemistry. We'll do, because in order to understand how we interact with molecules in the environment requires a knowledge of certain chemical properties. We'll also need to know a little physics, very little physics, because that's not my particular area, but a lot of this is going to have to do with understanding atmospheric conditions, and a lot of what we call the abiotic factors. We're also going to look at the science of biology a lot, because this deals with the interaction of organisms and also how our cells interact with molecules in the environment and with physical conditions of the environment. And we'll also be looking at engineering. Engineering is an incredible aspect of environmental science when it comes to look at how we build our cities, how we literally can engineer the earth to address certain environmental issues, and just to think of something as simple as even a toilet and sewage treatment systems, which we'll cover in this class, is all related to engineering. And then there comes the science of agriculture, which not too many people put into the science world. But I did my PhD work in the School of Agriculture, which is kind of funny when you think about it, but it's just that my research knowledge about the environment dealt well with the growing of crops. And then we get into the computer sciences, because all the data we handle in environmental science requires incredible computing power and the ability to interpret data in unique ways and very quickly. Now, to go outside of the sciences, we're going to see that sociology and psychology, or the human sciences or human behavioral sciences, play an important role in the cultural, political, and personal aspects of how we use and perceive the environment. And we're going to see we can catalog or categorize people into different psyches when it comes to how we maintain the environment and what our ecological footprint is as an individual and as a society. This also leads us to philosophy and ethics. We're going to see a little later too. So, and politics, which again is our way of enforcing or making a common culture in our society. So, and I left out the earth sciences, which is kind of a bad one, but the earth sciences, I relate with agriculture as far as again how we make use of the earth. Now, when we look at environmental science, again, it's very interdisciplinary and encompasses a lot of things like economics, whatever, you name it. And so every time we look at the science, we are going to look at how our behavior affects the science, how we use it based on our behavior, and also the economic aspects of decisions we make with the science. Now, when we discuss the term environment, we tend to think of sometimes nature, but environment is a big encompassing term, and it's literally everything that affects an organism or even affects the Earth in the lifetime of the Earth and the organism. And you're going to see that the first habitable planet, which I'll be assigning, has to do with the Earth and how it compares to other planets and how the history of the Earth significantly affects how we deal with environmental science today. So, in modern environmental science, we take this view called the ecosystem approach. And basically, when we start, I want to start off with the term ecosystem because this is the most manageable way we can think about the environment and how we fit in it with other things, and how various aspects of climate and geology affect us. So an ecosystem, according to many definitions, it's a distinct region or a boundary in which the organisms, which includes us, and the physical environment, that means things like weather, climate, geological features, form an interacting unit. And this is a unit that is not too big that we get so much data and not too small that we don't fully understand the whole picture. So we're going to hear about ecosystems and regions a lot in this class. And again, this is a manageable unit that we can study. And in many cases, it's an arbitrary unit because we kind of set somewhat scientifically and also somewhat politically, what is an ecosystem. So the task of environmental science is to recognize and understand these interactions within an ecosystem and then between ecosystems, and integrate these natural interactions with human uses. Okay, because you're going to see that the focus of environmental science is how humans make use of the Earth, and how do we go forth with it in ways that we can maintain resources, hopefully. So political and economic issues. Environmental problems do not necessarily coincide with artificial man-made political boundaries. And this is the funny thing when we start looking at ecosystems. Ecosystems could be within a political boundary, that means like a state or a county, or it can be in between them. And this leads to difficulties with decision making. And many creatures don't respect boundaries. They will migrate from country to country, weather travels from country to country, and it really ignores a lot of the artificial boundaries we set up, including anything from cities to whatever. And anything we build, we're going to see, is somewhat artificial in its own sense, okay, compared to how the environment interacts with it. And it would take care of it in somewhat natural ways. And we will see a wonderful video towards the end of this class about what would happen if people disappeared. What would that be like? And what would happen to our boundaries, to our artificial structures? We're going to see issues like air pollution that is generated in China in particular, okay, and in western coastal states, and parts of British Columbia and Canada. These are areas where we start to see a lot of effect on the environment, and we've run into a lot of balance between personal health, necessary resources that are exported globally, and looking at the compromises to the environment in order to have an economy. And this is also true for air pollution generated in Mexico, and you're going to read about this in your book, which causes problems to neighboring boundaries. So air pollution in Mexico affects Texas, and how do we deal with these issues? We also find that air pollution in the United States blows over into Canada and makes a lot of difficulties, particularly with commerce, when we start to learn that truck traffic is a major factor in air pollution, and how do two different countries meet their needs in regulating the amount of pollution and still have commerce. So these are just a couple of examples of how political and economic issues can be used with the science. So what are some emerging global issues? Okay, and one of the focus of your book, and probably the focus that a lot of environmental scientists take, is this idea of what we call sustainability. And part of my background before I became a professor, and I've noticed a couple of you are going into business or actually working in businesses right now, is I come from an industrial background. So I've worked in an industry for 5 years. I still consult in chemical manufacturing and biotechnology, particularly with genetically modified crops. So I understand how we need development. I understand how we need resources, and I understand how population grows is we start depending a lot on the earth for more and more resources every year. The idea of sustainability is probably important to everybody because it's a new way of looking at our resources in a way that we do conserve them with having the least negative impact on our quality of life and on the economics of a country. So we have to find this balance we're going to see that, believe me, the United Nations and other international entities are looking into significantly. And this is going to involve incredible cooperation between countries. We're going to start seeing almost a dropping of these geopolitical boundaries that we have. And when you think about the European community, as fragile it is right now with maintaining a structure, is they did a brave step to kind of separate their artificial borders and look at resources more from a regional, global perspective that affects all their economies. And they've learned that if one country starts using a lot of resources and overuses them, and that it impacts everybody. And if everybody tries to do that, they can run out real quickly. So we're seeing over the years, in the past 40 years, when the whole idea of sustainability came about, is that there's been a slow progress, but some real progress, okay, going on. And you see this in things like solar power, electric cars, using less resources, better gas efficiency in cars. All of these are little baby steps in getting into this world where we can live at a reasonable rate when our population reaches literally what we call the carrying capacity in the year 2050. And you're going to hear from me a lot in these lectures, the year 2050, because this is the time we believe, if human population growth continues as it does, we're going to see a population that will maybe outstrip its resources. And we have to either see the negative impacts of not doing anything or work for sustainability so we can maintain a steady state. That means not only in our population, but in resource usage. And I'm with a project right now on commercial space flight, which one of the answers of addressing resources is going into space and making it cheap and feasible to bring back resources from space. That is kind of a narrow, short-term answer, but it's still something we can do. And some other parts of that too, or maybe can we colonize other planets? Again, that's very short-term and very narrow because it's not stopping the problem or leading to sustainability, it's just expanding our boundaries, pretty much like colonialization. So what we're going to have to learn is ways of not ignoring the environment and not ignoring our ecosystems and making better use of ecosystems, taking out and putting back resources so that we can maintain this idea of sustainability. Funny enough, in the United States, part of environmental sustainability is under the Homeland Security Act. And this is kind of interesting. We start looking at simple things as water supplies, crops, sewage treatment. These are all considered security issues because the country can't be secure if we can't get adequate access to resources to maintain our current quality of life. And think about what's gone on with these past hurricanes lately, like Katrina and Harvey and Maria. They put us back to a time where we have no resources and putting us to a quality of life that goes back almost 5,000 years. And it's incredible of what that does to us because we're not ready for that. We're not prepared for that socially or politically. So imagine that occurring all the time in 2050 as far as losses of resources, not so much the natural disasters, but just due to a lack of petrol, a lack of materials we need to build things and maintain our lifestyle. As simple as even not having enough materials to keep a cell phone going, or the electricity, even power something as small as that. So, so we take it seriously, this whole idea of sustainability, because sustainability puts every country in the world under world security, to being secure. And this is why we're also interested in developing countries too, because they're going to be growing at a rate greater than us and starting to want more and more resources. And we have to find a way of sharing these and not keeping them from growing based on these resources, is they're going to grow in spite of it. And this can lead to an incredible competition of resources, which is not going to be a pretty picture. So, so when a person's access to natural resources and ecosystem services is threatened, we will see that there's a conflict and social instability. And this is something we don't want to see in 2050. And I use that term ecosystem services. We're going to come upon this a little later. But basically, this is a new way of looking at our world as a critical resource that you don't destroy. We look at it almost like, you know, a parent or someone supplying us with something. Is we don't want to destroy that resource. We want to maintain it and keep it, and not so much exploit it, but make use of it in a way that we can both coexist. So a lot of this course, we're going to be dealing with, again, humans in the environment. In environmental science, we have to understand we're practicing this as a human endeavor. And we're going to look at humans not any differently from other creatures. Is that we have population growth based on various factors, and we're going to see that if our population grows too much, like any creature, there could be problems. And in the animal world and the plant world, when overgrowth occurs, usually what brings it down is starvation, disease, and a lack of resources, very similar to what humans encounter. And we see this a lot in almost 70% of the world with developing nations today, where people don't have enough resources for basic needs, for just survival needs. They have unchecked disease. And in some cases, it really doesn't affect their population growth. They still keep growing and growing. And we're going to deal with these issues a little later because they're very controversial issues. But it's also important to remember that developed countries like us, we tend to use 10 to 100 times more resources than they do per person. So we're going to pay close attention to how do we deal with this population issue? How do we get to a world of 2050 and still keep our sanity and still keep the quality of life that we want? Because any type of growth in human populations is going to put a heavy demand on resources. And as we develop more of a need for resources, like in our country, is that we're going to see that this has a greater effect on other people and on competition for resources. Because when you're competing for resources, a lot of times it ends up with unequal distribution, which then leads to a large amount of poverty. So, what do we mean by ecosystem services? And what do we mean by sustainability in general? And much of this is just the fact of, as we do our things as humans, is that we maintain functional ecosystems that provide us with these resources. And we can look at what are called natural ecosystems, we'll deal with a little later in the course, and artificial ecosystems, which includes things like agriculture and villages, and that includes things like manufacturing, the conversion of natural resources into items, to services. So when we look at maintaining the environment, we're going to have to somehow look at the environment, every aspect about it, the science, the biology, the chemistry, what's called the biodiversity, that means the creatures in the environment, things like weather, because our human growth and development affects weather. So we're going to have to figure out, how do we understand all of this and look at our impact on it and see how this will affect us in the future as well, our population burdens, and how do we change our behaviors in the future? So as our population grows, we cannot, cause decay to these ecosystem services and somehow enhance them, recycle them, or maintain them. So, other issues in environmental science, when we start looking at agriculture, we're going to focus on food security. Again, humans are part of nature. Again, this is why we practice environmental science. And even my friends that study just ecosystems and animals, they still know that they're doing this not just to protect these creatures, but also the habitable earth that we live in. So, when we start looking at agricultural systems, okay, we're going to see that this earth is divided into two as far as how we produce and obtain food. We still have people that grow their own individual family food, that hunt, that gather, A lot of the earth still does this when you go into developing countries. We're going to see that us, with our types of farming, we have one person can produce food for thousands, but also that produce a lot of food, but an incredible demand for food that is what we call monoculture. I mean, very consistent and very limited in scope, because a farm can just produce only particular types of foods. When we start looking at natural disasters, how does this impact us? How does this impact food security, public health, and factors like this? So all of these, fit into the guise of environmental issues and how this determine our ethics. Again, environmental health. You hear about things like Zika. We're hearing all these diseases coming up, particularly viral diseases, mosquito-borne diseases. The World Health Organization is just literally in a frenzy looking at all these upcoming diseases. And a lot of these diseases are due to our own human footprint of what we do as far as pollutants, as far as diversion of water, as far as global climate change, and as far as the growing human population. So when we look at how we handle the environment, we can have an impact or a footprint that makes the environment more likely to produce human disease. And this is even true of even how we do agriculture, keeping agricultural animals close to ourselves is a way of spreading disease. Energy usage, big factor. Particularly developed countries, we are big petrol users, and we use a lot of energy, particularly for transportation and for living. An average American uses 10 times, sometimes 100 times more energy resources just for for luxury needs, not so much basic needs. And a lot of the consequences of energy are also pollution, particularly air pollution and water pollution. So this is going to be a very hot topic when we get to it. And part of sustainability we're going to see is not just reducing our need for these what we call unsustainable resources, meaning use of fossil fuels like coal or oil, but also how do we find alternatives? And not just alternatives that are substitutes for petrol and coal, but ones that produce less pollution. And then there's a big issue, and we saw this with Harvey, we see this with other storms, is that what's called environmental justice. We have learned that certain parts of the population are more susceptible to environmental harm, to pollution, to poor quality of living compared to other people. And we're going to see that they disproportionately get the pollution while having less access to resources. Whereas we see in other areas, particularly in Houston, where people have a lot of resources and they don't receive the pollution from that. They don't live near the garbage dumps, they don't live near the power plants, they don't live near the manufacturing companies or the petrol companies that give them the resources that they use. So a large part of our poor people, and this even includes developing countries, bear the burden of a civilization, and particularly for materials that they don't use. And you're going to start seeing in the future what we call user fees. This is going to be a big model right now for you pay for the use of the environment. And there are people that are even looking at, for every person that's born gets a chunk of equal resources. And then we could use these resources to barter if people want more or people want less. And so this is becoming a global concern of injustice and distribution of resources. Why do some people get more? Why do some get less? And why do some of the people suffer from more of the pollutants and negative impacts of our technology than others? So again, when we start looking at environmental justice, this is within the scope of environmental science, because it is part of the human condition of how we live in nature. So again, with environmental justice, we're going to look at how pollution affects us. And I know when I was in industry, the company I was with worked with hazardous chemicals, and because of the nature of zoning in St. Louis, Missouri, most of the manufacturing was in poor neighborhoods, and the people that lived there suffered disproportionately from the pollution of what that company did, and few of them received the benefits of the company. We're going to see transportation is a big environmental justice issue, where we still live in a very individual car-focused nation, and we don't have the full freedom of people to travel by public transportation that you see in other countries. We are very underserved as far as getting people around through mass transportation. Safe housing, that means housing free from not just crime, but free from pollution, particularly lead poisoning, water quality. In our own area here, we have areas just south of Kingwood, which have no good running water, no adequate sewage treatment, and they have old houses that still contain lead within them that actually has airborne lead that can cause brain damage in children. Access to recreation is one of the major things that people look at when they want to be in what's called a livable city. There were surveys done nationally on what's the first thing you want out of a place to live. And it's funny, but right next to jobs, people want access to recreation. And you see this in our area with green belts and with the parks in downtown Houston, and basically, you know, our national parks, our state parks. So recreation is important to us, what we call green space. And undisturbed land is, funny enough, fundamental to us as an organism. Exposure to noise pollution. I live near an airport. We get a lot of it sometimes. And we can see that this not only affects humans, but affects animals. And again, poor people tend to live disproportionately closer to airports. I'm not as close as some of the other communities that receive a maximum of that airplane noise, particularly with the takeoff and landings. They live right near the runways. Access to environmental information is important. The people that need the information sometimes don't get it. And how many of you are aware of the ozone alert days, which basically means that the air quality is so bad at times that you should not even be outside, children should not be playing, and elderly people should be ready to go to a hospital for assist oxygen. We've had days in Houston where the air quality was so bad, literally 50% of the population had headaches, and nobody knew what it was from. Certain people had the information. People in poor communities don't understand the pollution in their area. And this is something I work at a lot with a group called American Association for the Advancement of Science and for the U.S. Human Rights Network. And I do this overseas too with other agencies, is we give people the power of understanding their environment so they can make informed decisions and look at the cost benefits of their living conditions. We generate a lot of hazardous waste. And again, a lot of this ends up disproportionately contaminating the poor and actually the rural too, because this is where we dump a lot of stuff, particularly radioactive and very nasty materials. And we also see that with exposure to natural disasters is, again, the poor people, and we're not just talking in the United States, we're talking globally, tend to be and live in areas that are more susceptible to natural disasters. And I've seen in my travels landslides and river floodings that literally killed or displaced dozens of people. I've seen this in the Philippines, in Honduras and Guatemala, where lives were lost because the poor were put in these areas that were very susceptible to natural disaster, and the wealthy people did not. So your book makes a point of what they call the call for a new ethic. And what this means to me is a whole idea of looking at the earth not from political boundaries, but from how does the environment affect us globally? How does everybody affect each other? And how can we live in a planet in a sustainable way as our populations grow? And, you know, my parents, they come from countries that are not growing, from Belarus and Hungary, which actually Hungary is showing negative growth. So their populations are having less impact on the earth. United States is showing almost a stable, what we call a sustainable growth. That means we're almost at replacement point, with almost 2.4 children per family, now aiming towards 2.2. Other countries still see 7 children per family, and these children are living longer, which means they're reaching the point where they can start producing those 7 children. So we got to look at these factors and look at how resources are distributed, but also understand that the larger countries, even with the smaller growth rates, still disproportionately use more resources and tend to have the ability to exploit those resources. And sometimes we're sitting on those resources and make use of them for ourselves without a global sharing. And in many cases, the poor countries that have these burgeoning populations are sitting on the resources, and we're trying to buy it from them. And as their populations grow and want to start make use of those resources, we're going to see a difficulty in leveraging those. So if we keep up the pace of countries building basically political boundaries within themselves as if they were walls, we're going to see much more difficulty, much more hatred, much more war as resources become more scarce and disproportionately distributed. So when we look at ethics, when we use the term ethic, we got to be real careful here. And your book, unfortunately, is not, because most environmental scientists don't. They're mostly scientists and engineers, and we get a background in something else. But during my education, I made sure I had a very strong philosophy background. Literally almost 2 years of philosophy at the undergraduate and a year at the graduate level. So what ethics is, yes, your textbook says it's a branch of philosophy, but we're going to see that this is dealing with cultural issues. We're going to see that this is dealing with issues that we define more based on culture, more based on how we learn about ourselves, on human behavior, and on what this whole issue is of what's called right and wrong. And right and wrong is a human thing. It is not a scientific construct. Science looks at what is good and what is bad for a situation. So, for example, one situation I got in the middle of once was many years ago, traveling to give a talk in Alaska. I was giving a talk at a museum called the Imaginarium from a friend of mine who was the director of the museum. And while I was there, he said, I want to make use of your environmental science. I want you to talk to our governor, which at the time was Sarah Palin. And he said, I have an issue about a policy she was enacting to increase the moose population of Alaska, because moose hunting is a very big hobby in Alaska, and it brings in millions of dollars to their economy. So they want to maintain it. And this became, for me, an issue of right and wrong and good and bad that I didn't want to get into. So, for example, Sarah Palin, literally her science advisor said, hey, one way to control moose populations is to get rid of predators. Another way is to increase their food source. Another way is to protect them. Well, increasing their food source is difficult. That would mean we may have to cut down cities and provide more feeding range for the animals. And that would be a difficult thing. We couldn't increase the amount of land to keep their population going with the hunting. You can restrict hunting, but that would again affect the economy. You could also raise the moose, but they're not as easy as cows, and they do require more food per moose and more area per moose to take over. So cultivating them was not an issue. So her simplest avenue was to go with killing wolves. And the problem with killing wolves is they're hard to find, yet they travel long distances, so she used helicopters to do it. Using, I forgot if it was military helicopters or National Guard, whatever. So they started a campaign of killing the predators, not to oblivion, but just to reduce the wolf population. And this caused a big stir in the environmental community, because wolves tend to be close to endangerment. They are important predators overall for a lot of things. They keep a lot of animals in check, and killing them off not would just raise the moose population, but also the population of particularly pest animals, including rodents, in which young wolves hunt and wolves sometimes hunt in the winter as an alternate food source. So this was looking at a very difficult issue that had a lot of reasonable answers. And what my friend was trying to get me to do was basically use science to say that it was bad to kill off the wolves. And I could not find a strong argument to say that that was a bad strategy scientifically to raise the moose population. Now, of course, it's bad for the wolves, but it's good for the moose. But what he was really asking me to do was say whether it was right or wrong. And as a scientist, I can't do that. As a human who has my own ethical value systems, I can do that. And I can even do that from moral perspective if I wanted to, if there was moral reasoning for it. Because morals, we're going to see, and your authors confuse this with ethics, is more or less religious perspectives of things, no matter what the religion is. And we're going to see that when we start looking at different perspectives. So when we look at ethics, understand these are the rights and wrongs we deal with when we're looking at social structures, political entities, legal issues, whatever. Morals is to be based more with religious aspects of how do we interpret nature and how do we make decisions. And in some country where religion is the law, they have no issue with the distinction between ethics and morals. But in our country, we do. And we're going to see that there are environmental ethicists and environmental moralists. And then there are environmental absolutists, which means they're scientists that look at everything from a scientific perspective, and this good and bad, not right or wrong way of looking at things. And we also look at humans as just another animal that is subject to those ethics. And that means sometimes we have to have ethical decisions that impact humans in negative ways. So, because we're not a homogeneous world, we are going to see that one of the biggest problems in environmental science is not so much a problem as, to me, it's a challenge. Is to look at how do we take conflicting ethical positions and moral positions and make policy from it. How do we apply science in an ethical way, in a moral way that reduces conflict and sometimes comes out with the best answer. And sometimes we end up with an answer that makes a lot of people unhappy and a certain group happy. Sometimes we come up with answers that don't make anybody happy. And this is the whole beauty of looking at when we take ethical positions. So when we start looking at resources, particularly like logging, for example, which is shown in the PowerPoint here. We need logging for commerce. We need logging for everything we do, basically. Wood is a very valuable commodity, but we also have to maintain healthy forests in order to get these logs. So this is a real ethical balance. And there are some people we're going to learn that put primary focus on protecting the forest, while others want to protect the logging, and each of these is going to be at a consequence of each other. And then there's those that are in between that say we have to balance this and come to a compromise. And we're going to see that the world is ultimately looking at coming to a lot of compromises, because this then builds what we call sustainability. So where does all this ethical conflict come from? What we're going to look at now is philosophical approaches, and this is going to be layered. That means you're going to see one global approach, and then within that approach, minor little fluctuations within it and little subcategories. So one way we can divide people's attitudes about how they perceive the environment is by how people perceive their role in nature. And one way we can look at ourselves is look at ourselves as being what we call anthropocentric. That means that humans are the center of the earth, the center of nature. What I mean by the center is that we're the primary focus, and that the earth is meant for us. We are it, no more. Anthropocentrists tend to look at the earth as something that we harvest from and use. It's meant for us. This could also be a moral approach too, because some people sometimes interpret in their moral readings or religious readings that the earth was designed for the use of humans. Unfortunately, there was no way of explaining that use, and people looked at it as outright just sometimes abuse. So anthropocentrists see themselves first, and any environmental decision that is made is there to benefit humans, and the environment is secondary. So if our activities cause harm to the environment, if it's providing a benefit to us, our benefit comes before the harm. Biocentrics are somewhat the opposite. They look at humans as one tiny little speck on the earth, and we are just a minimum part of the picture. We believe that the earth is what we focus on. All living things have an inherent value. And basically the way I kind of joke about this is that squirrels have equal rights to resources as we do. And I think about this all the time, living in a house where I have squirrels and other animals running around and have roaches coming in from outside. I go, you know what? They have an equal share of this. This is my biocentric part, is I have just as, they have just as right to be here as me, versus I'm in charge and this is my place, get lost. So these people tend to be a little as equally extreme as the anthropocentrists, but more global centric. And you see sometimes indigenous cultures will have this view. They see themselves as one is equal with nature, and actually sometimes underneath nature, and that they know that they're harming nature in the process of them living, and even sometimes apologize for it. And I've seen these cultures. It's really interesting. The middle ground, which is where most environmentalists are, is we tend to be ecocentric and practice what's called ecocentrism, not egocentric. That's, almost close to anthropocentric. But ecocentrism is more of a balance. We take an ecosystem approach in which we try to balance all the factors in nature that contribute to the sustainability of that environment, plus keep us happy. So they're sort of like in between, or a blend of the anthropocentrist and biocentrist. So within these categories now, we're going to move on to some other ethical systems that we can fit into this picture of what is an environmental ethic. Now, another layer to philosophical approaches are very specific items that have to do with what I call sub-philosophies. So there's a concept called ecofeminism, and some of these you might have fun looking up online just to see the websites, what they promote, and who's involved in this. Ecofeminism is more of a way of looking at the earth as a mother, and also looking at the rights of women in the earth. We're going to learn that women are more disproportionately affected by pollution and poverty and lack of resources than men, and they suffer more a lot because it also impacts the children, particularly when they're pregnant and also when they're taking care of young children. So women are looking at more of designing a world that's sustainable and protective of women, and not leaving men out, but knowing that if we're protecting women, we're also protecting men at the same time, and we're setting a higher threshold of protection. So ecofeminism, again, it's a very broad ethic, and again, it involves things like Mother Earth. Nature nurtures us, and we take care of it very much like you take care of a mother, but also you take care of females because they have a very critical role in nature. And then there's something called social ecology. This is a philosophical movement that looks at where do societies fit into nature, and how do we design societies that are more environmentally friendly, and how did societies get to where they were? So this involves a little psychology, a lot of understanding history, and we use a lot of social ecology to understand how cultures think, and we sometimes make laws to fit into social ecology. For example, Native Americans, indigenous South Americans, indigenous Filipinos, they all have a very similar social ecology, but that is very distinct from the people that colonize their countries. So we have to sometimes design different laws, different policies to these value systems. The next one I just finished a book review for, okay, because as a scientist sometimes I have to review books that are published so that other readers will know what they're about and to basically critique the book. And I thought I knew deep ecology till I read the book, and I was just blown away by the complexity of this. But this is what I would sometimes call an impractical type of ethic, which really looks deep down inside of how humans are impacted by the environment and how humans impact the environment from a very, very, very deep philosophical level that goes back to our ancestry. So it's really a bunch of deep thinkers that basically come up with how do we make decisions that fit our past, prepare us for the future, and also protect the environment, but also protect the fact that we are disturbers of the environment. So a lot of it would make difficult to make policy out of this, but it's also an important feeder for content information for the social ecologists, because it helps us to better understand humans from the perspective of nature and what are things supposed to be. Because there are a lot of groups that believe that people are just pollutants to the earth. And in deep ecology, what they would do is look at that as, well, that's our role. And that can sometimes be very disturbing to say, yeah, we are damaging the earth, but that's our role. And we wouldn't be the only animal that's done that in the past. Environmental pragmatism, this is something I work with a lot. This tends to be a middle ground environmental view. And these people look at, again, how do we make practical use of the earth that benefits people and also benefits the earth? Okay, again, this is on the road to sustainability when we look at pragmatism. Pragmatism meaning basically practical. How do we do things where we're not harming ourselves and allowing no long-term negative impacts? Environmental aesthetics, this sometimes includes a little biocentrism, and this is where people look at nature for the beauty of nature. Aesthetics basically mean appearance. So in this field, what we see is that these people are the kind you see like are bird lovers. They like a particular thing. They would be nature lovers. They like flower lovers. A lot of nature photographers tend to be aestheticists. So some people even look at mountains and rocks as having an aesthetic value. So this tends to be a very biocentric view that gives not just intensive beauty, but intentional rights to other creatures, equal to that of humans, and in some cases exceeding the value of humans. And this last group sometimes gets some bad press. Animal rights, animal welfare people tend to be highly biocentric. Some tend to be ecocentric, but they believe that by preserving animals, we're also preserving ourselves. But they believe that animals have their own rights, inherent rights, and that we should protect them and not do anything that affects their welfare. So you have groups like PETA, the PETA for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and people that are, and other groups, and they have a lot to say. They contribute a lot to our understanding of how do we use nature, and maybe we should be treating nature more carefully and taking into consider that other creatures have just as much access to the earth as we do. And just because we're bigger and have bigger toys and could damage them and ruin their resources, it doesn't mean we should. Next, here's another layer, and this is what I love about this course. So you can be an ecocentric, animal welfare person, and then also have another attitude added to this. And this again could be at a country level. These three could be at an individual level, and we usually see this reflected in the country's culture and laws. So certain countries, certain groups of people follow what's called a development approach. And basically with this approach, this tends to be much more anthropocentric, in which people have the right to develop the earth, and that's what the earth is there for. And we believe that development is a progress of bigger and better toys and more luxury, more leisure, and things like that. So this is where we get the idea of cell phones from and all this incredible personal technology and incredibly packed cities, big cars. So developmentalists, or the developmental approach, are the ones you most likely see in a city. And again, we tended to see that Europe, particularly Northern Europe, had a very strong developmental approach that led them to basically colonize other countries and take their development with them. And they were very almost appalled by those people that did not have a developmental approach and considered them to be primitive. Then there's the preservation approach. And how do you recognize a preservation approach? You're in an indigenous culture. But you're also with people that believe that nature should be preserved and kept away from people. So this is an approach that protects nature from people. And we have what are actually called preserves. Nature preserves. That means people cannot live there, cannot take the resources out, no matter at all. And this is an approach that interferes with a lot of our quality of life and definitely works against a developmental approach. Well, conservation approach. This again tends to be in the middle. It's more ecocentric, if you want to think of it that way, and it tends to be very sustainable. So conservationists tend to balance development with preservation. And in some cases, we will say, well, let's not develop in this area if we're doing something that's going to make something go extinct, then we have to preserve it, or we have to preserve a habitat. So again, all of these attitudes blend together, merge together to make a culture, to make it individual, and think about their ideas. So when we start looking at how do we affect the environment, how do we make laws to protect it, how do we make laws to protect ourselves, we have to look at all these individual ideas and every person, what we call stakeholders' input. Now, to kind of go into a little more detail with the preservation approach, this approach tends to be the most ecocentric and sometimes not really biocentric. It can be on your perspective, but when we look at preservation, this is looking at more of an intrinsic value of nature for human uses. It's protecting nature, yes, for the sake of nature, but it's also for more of an aesthetic reason. So when we look at preservation, these are resources these are places, these are resources in themselves that we don't take things out of. So we find that there are nature preserves. You see these a lot in Africa. You see some in the Middle East and Caribbean islands. We have oceanic ones, United States we have several, but that means you can only go here and walk through it and maybe camp in it, but not take anything out. You don't take out trees, nothing, no resources. And this differs a lot from the conservation approach. And when we look at conservation, we have to be really careful to not confuse preservation with conservation, because like our national parks are primarily conservation areas, and that means we keep these aside so that we have resources. Theodore Roosevelt was very interested in this, to having land put aside so that people could make use of it for hunting. And also we put aside national parks to maintain trees, not for the sake of trees and preservation, but for the fact that we harvest them and use them. And if you even get around the Huntsville area, you can see these huge tree farms in the area between Highway 59 and Highway 69, that whole area, where they're constantly harvesting trees but also growing new ones. That's conservation. So that's making use of nature also for the purpose of people having resources. Now, we also find that not only individuals and political systems and countries have ethics, so could certain sectors of society, and particularly entities like corporations, because they form almost like their own country within a country. And I understand the corporate ethic because I worked in it and had to walk a fine line between protecting the environment and protecting the living of people, the resources for people, and also protecting stakeholders and the owners of the company. So corporate ethical systems have gone from very developmental and very anthropocentric, and finding out that that was not a good attitude to have, because it led to a lot of extreme pollution, a lot of overuse of resources like overfishing, and it caused a lot of strife between nations that were and areas that were sharing resources or affected by resource use. So corporate ethic has evolved a lot, from the corporate grabbers to now we look at ways of using of manufacturing things in sustainable ways. So corporations are moving a little more towards sustainability, a little more green, because they're finding out that producing less pollution is much more economical. Doesn't sound like that. Sometimes you hear it on the news. And we look at all sorts of different regulations like ISO, which is International Standards Organizations, and the 14,000 series has to do for environmental compliance. So we see all sorts of things that corporations are finding out they can make profits and they can provide things for people, material resources, in a sustainable way, in a more environmentally friendly way, again, and in a way that people are pleased with the companies themselves rather than maintaining the old ethic. So we're seeing less and less actions in corporation, like dumping. We still hear of illegal dumping, but even with dumping a simple waste, we're finding out that there's more value in treating the waste, and in some cases companies sell their waste now. So this whole idea of the new corporate ethic is we're finding ways to even make money by not polluting, and this is really kind of neat. Now, something we do have to avoid is this concept called greenwashing, And sometimes this is when a company provides information that makes themselves look green, but they're basically not. And we see this, unfortunately, with a lot of recycling, because recycling, like of paper, yeah, you're reducing the use of forests resources and trees, and you're reducing landfills, but it's also one of the major water polluters and air polluters. If you've ever been around a paper recycling plant, it can do incredible environmental damage to nearby waterways. So we have to be careful when somebody says something is green that it really is. Because even, with alternative fuels, like biofuels, they are only green because they reduce the use of petrol. But we tend to greenwash them by making them think that they're clean, but no, they produce the same greenhouse gases and other types of pollutants that regular petroleum does. So when we look at corporations, again, we have to think of them as legal entities that operate for a profit, but they're also operating with the assumption that, they have to work within political systems, and they often have to work with what people want, and they're basically driven by supply and demand. And this is kind of the funny thing when we start pointing our fingers at corporations, because they're an entity that's easy to see. We can point them out, and they're easy to deal with than a government. So when we start complaining that, company X is making all these hazardous chemicals, who's buying those hazardous chemicals? Who's using them? What are petrol companies making? They're not just making stuff for the sake of making stuff. They're making stuff based on our demand. And if we didn't demand petroleum and plastics and all sorts of things, they wouldn't make it. They go in a different direction. And you're finding corporations like Shell are heavily going into non-fossil fuel resources. They're looking at solar, and it's not so they can steal the market from it and learn how to make money on solar. Whoever sets up solar has to make money. But they're doing it because they know that petrol is going to have to be weaned out. And if people lose demand for petrol, they want to be ahead of the curve. So corporations, again, they're responding to us. And corporations reflect a culture. When you get into places like China, which have corporations that provide outside resources, this leads to a really interesting ethical systems, because the people are not benefiting at all from the resources that these companies are making, but just from the money from it. But they're disproportionately getting the pollution that we're not getting. And we're going to see some videos on China and look at this issue and think about who's the primary cause of the issue. Is it the Chinese government that's running these factories, or is it really our demand for materials that's causing them to produce the supply, and the fact that they can produce it at a cost that's not profitable here, because we don't want to pay the cost of us doing it. So within environmental science, what are some other big issues? Again, associated with our own development is waste and pollution. And we're going to see that this is a natural process. All organisms produce waste. All creatures produce pollution. The earth produces natural pollution. But what's the cost of dealing with this? And how can we reduce our environmental footprint of producing pollution, including our own pollution, like even just something simple as sewage treatment? So we're going to see that, sometimes this ethical issue was breached. Before we had the Environmental Protection Agency in the 70s, corporations just randomly produced pollution in large amounts. And we see that the new ethical attitude is showing that this is not environmentally friendly, it's not good for the consumer in itself, and it's also now profitable to reduce pollution at times, depending on penalties, because sometimes you pay for pollution. But now we learn that you can sell pollution or reduce pollution and still come up with a good product and make a profit. So again, corporate environmental ethics, a lot of it is based on the stockholders that want money. They expect a return, but also it's driven by us. We're the ones that are causing the companies to do this because we're creating the demand for that service. And if we didn't create that demand, the stockholders would be bailing out of a company that's not making money for them. So again, we're the driving force behind a lot of this. So to muddle all this together, what we're hoping for as a world and as individual countries is to try to take all these ethical differences and try to make them into a compromise, or try to explain to the extreme views is that, hey, this might work well. So sustainable development scientifically is considered a very achievable goal. Politically, socially, we don't know if that's true or not. But sustainable development is not the perfect thing. It's a middle ground that makes a lot of people happy, but many people unhappy. And we're going to see that it involves social aspects of living. How do we meet supply and demand? How do we meet our needs? How do we maintain a standard of living? How do we have a growing population in this earth, or maybe even control that growing population? What do we do about it? How do we deal with all our ethical systems and work with it in a way that preserves the environment so that we have an environment for the future that provides the equal resources we have currently and forever? And then how do we do this economically so it's not killing us financially so that we can't afford a certain quality of life? We're going to see that sustainability for many people is just bearable. That means it's tolerable. It's not going to be the ideal conditions. We hope that it ends up equitable, and much more equitable than we see right now with the super rich and the super poor. And that it's viable. That means we can live that way. Yes, we have to bear it, but also can we live that way? And is it going to be something that can be carried on through the future based on the economics and changes in attitudes and whatever? So this is a very complex model that's not just looking at the preservation of the earth, but the preservation of economies, our own social structure, and doing it within a compromise. So, when we think about sustainability, what are the limitations? Because part of it is this concept called the global ecological footprint. Many countries don't need to be sustainable. They're already there, or they're so poor they can't worry about it. We're in a country that has an overabundance of resources in a world that has dwindling resources. We have a reason to be sustainable. But in a way, sometimes we don't, because we sometimes say, well, we'll come up with a technological fix. So right now, the big the great disparity between those that have and those that don't is going to be a limitation to sustainability. But think about your own living. What are you willing to give up to preserve resources for the future? Or what are you willing to pay for it so that we can have resources continuously and for the future, and so that the rest of the world can have access to these resources too? So there has to be a lot of sharing going on, and again, a lot of compromise. And are we willing to do this? And the great disparity of cultures makes sustainability very difficult. It is one major limitation. And part of this limitation, again, is the ethics of consumption. Are we willing to change our consumption to allow other people to consume like us? Are we willing to drop it? Are we willing to live different lifestyles that we still have our basic needs met, but they might not be the luxury needs that we have already? So again, when we start looking at sustainability in this class, we're going to spend some time on agriculture, the ethics of food production. And again, this is not just a sustainability thing, this is a security thing. Because without food, we put ourselves in a very dangerous, insecure situation, in situations that lead to incredible strife in this world. Our energy usage right now is not sustainable. How do we develop an energy ethic that is sustainable, but again, maintains our quality of life to what we have it now? And in some cases, what are we willing to compromise? Water, one of the greatest needs right now of all resources is water. Matter of fact, we have more of a water crisis than a food crisis. And yes, water is available, but a lot of it is unavailable because it's in forms that we cannot get a hold of. We'll learn this when we look more at water. We see in our country, we have fights over who's getting water. In Houston, we have an aquifer, a nice clean source of water, but it's going to start being more and more restrictive to people as the city grows. So if you live outside of Beltway 610, you're going to find out that we're not going to have access to the water anymore. Areas outside of 610 are going to have to look for alternative water. It means wells and river water and other stuff, which we know is going to be expensive to clean and might not be as available as that aquifer. And then we still have to think about our consumption is the role of nature, because our consumption of resources for farmland, for natural, for minerals, for homes, for factories, all take away from wild nature. How do we balance this? And when we start looking at deep ecology, do we really give a damn about nature? Should we? Can we exist without a lot of it? So we're seeing that our own non-sustainable lifestyles right now, this ethic of consumption that we have, is making for bad, environmental decisions. And again, there's personal choices. So within each government, within each ethic, we're going to have to see that there's compromise. And we have to see that sometimes we have to make different personal choices to get to the goal of sustainability. Again, this is not an easy avenue. And I might be a big promoter of sustainability, but I'm also a pragmatist. That means that I know even in my own life, I'm not willing to give up a cell phone to reduce the amount of mining, the devastation of mining done in Africa and Asia to get the rare materials to build cell phones, which are very toxic. Cell phones are toxic in landfills. They're very difficult to recycle. We exploit a lot of child labor and foreign labor to do that. And so here I am with the convenience of a cell phone and the technology I'm doing this with, and I know it's doing environmental harm. So how do I live my life and maintain this and encourage sustainability? Because I know my footprint is huge just living in this country. Not my personal footprint, but my resource footprint. And how to me as an individual, do I count as an individual? Does it really make a difference if one person doesn't do it? Or how do I set an example for you that you should be sustainable if I'm promoting it? Because am I really promoting it too? So when we look at personal choices, what are you willing to conserve? What are you willing to do? I lived in New York City for a lot of my life, and I never needed a car. And I was happy with public transportation because there was a beautiful infrastructure in New York City and the surrounding states that you can literally go to Massachusetts or go to Washington, D.C. without needing a car. You can go all the way out to Pennsylvania without needing a car. It was wonderful. It was literally like having a transport system that would take you from, Orange, Texas to El Paso. Incredible. We don't have that in Texas. So I find myself using a car a lot, and I'm inconvenienced by public transport because I have to drive to get there or I have a long walk. That was not true in New York or in California or even when I was living overseas in certain areas where they had incredible public transportation. Even in Beijing, I was able to get around anywhere and even faster by train than by car. How we live. Large cities are not the best thing to build. It is a bad model of development. But my personal choice is to live in one. I grew up with one. Suburbs are equally horrible as cities. They have even more of an impact because of what we call horizontal living. We'll learn about this. And as personal choice, how far are you willing to go to express your choice? We're going to talk about lobbying. We're going to talk about how do you become politically active. And when you start looking at things like, oh, I'm going to like this on Facebook, I'm going to sign off on this petition, I'm going to do this or that, I'm going to send a pre-typed letter. Politicians don't pay attention to that. They pay attention to personal emails, not group emails. They pay attention to letters, believe it or not, if anybody even knows how to fill out a letter and put a stamp on it. When we start looking at how do you become politically active, it takes time. It takes face-to-face. It takes being there. It takes meeting with your politicians, meeting with lobbyists. I serve on many local, national, international committees where I am giving up time, family time, classroom time, my own recreational time, to do that. And I am putting myself on the line, exposing myself by being part of a protest, being part of a group that is giving scientific information to politicians. So these are all our personal choices. Is what influence is your ethic going to have, and how do you protect your ethic, no matter what it is? So last but not least, this was a lot of information, but chapters 1 and 2 basically look at this whole idea of environmental science is involves everything, no matter what your major is. I mean, if you're going into cooking, we have green cooks. We learn a lot of chefs learn that the way we prepare food in developed countries is we waste 40% of the food and discard a lot, and we don't make use of certain things that can become food products. We have a bunch of invasive creatures like lionfish and these things called tiger shrimp, which are devastating the Gulf of Mexico right now. And now we're learning they have commercial value if we just learn to eat them. We think of them as pests. And we're going to get into that a lot when we look at agriculture and alternative agricultures. How do we feed ourselves using other means besides cattle, besides the traditional crops that we have? This chapter also looks at the whole idea of the ecosystem approach, the regional approach. How do we look at nature in a way that we can best understand it and manipulate it and study it and live within it and understand its impacts on us and our impact on it? And then the whole philosophy issue and ethics and moral issues is this is how we make human decisions, both individually, as regions, as countries, and as global citizens. And guys, we have to learn that everybody is part of the earth, and that when we have an impact on the earth, it impacts other people. And even if we don't care about that, we have to pay attention. Those people also impact us. So this is, when we start looking at the ethics, we have to start thinking about sustainable ethical systems that keep us as a growing population that is not going to outstrip resources, is not going to also get to the point where we're killing each other and go into war. And how can we live in a secure way that I know my food and water supplies are safe? So if you have any questions, please send me an email or leave a voicemail. And also what I'm going to do is within the module of lesson 1 with this video, I'm also going to post an assignment that goes with this. Particularly, I'm going to give you an assignment on Habitable Planet and also a case study to read through and answer the questions. And thank you.